This week we'll be talking about how individuals become socialized into their respective sports. This is going to be closely tied to youth sport, which we'll explore soon, but what we're going to be looking at is not only how one becomes socialized into their sport, which is connected with youth sport because many of us are socialized into our sport as youths. However, that's not a universal case. For example, I myself was not allowed to participate in sports until I was in high school. But then also we're going to be looking at how one stays connected to their sport over time and across the lifespan. So what does that process look like? So that will take us into exploring even further the sport ethic, which is the ethos that we have around sport and essentially the ethos that we are socialized into believing. So a basic definition of socialization is a process in which an individual becomes a member of society or a community. And essentially socialization is how we learn about our world, essentially how we develop our own worldview. We are assimilated into our various cultures. Now that can go from the macro level to even the micro level, where we're assimilated into U.S. culture, which has its own values, norms, and behavioral patterns. But then we're also socialized into our individual kind of subcultures within that. So, for example, Colorado, Boulder in particular, the University of Colorado. Perhaps you belong to a fraternity or a sorority, an athletic team. All of those individual spaces have cultures, and you are socialized into them. Try and imagine the first time that you joined a sports team or joined a club. You show up, you're anxious, you're not really sure what's going on, and you slowly learn kind of the language and how to be and how to behave. For example, when I first joined rowing, some of the first lessons that I learned were both spoken and unspoken rules. So two spoken rules were, one, you never step over a boat. Boats are only 1/4 of an inch thick, and so if you step over it and you trip, you could easily put your foot right through the boat. And on the same vein, never step in the bottom of a boat, also because it's so thin. Two things that our coach told us right from the start and reiterated over and over again. Now, an unspoken rule that I learned was talking in the boat. And commenting on other people's technique and strokes. That is something that is not a spoken rule. It's not something your coach necessarily tells you, but it is definitely a rule amongst rowers that you never comment on another person's stroke. And of course, rowing is unique in that what are you doing but staring at a bunch of different people as they're rowing. You can see what they are and are not doing. And so you kind of learn that through the process of either getting punched, if you do it, or being told, on the sly by another, varsity member, we don't do that. So, socialization is, it is a part of our human development. It unifies us within a culture, and those who don't socialize or aren't socialized or assimilate into the culture are often what we consider our outliers, folks who we just don't quite understand, because socialization is kind of that binding thread within our community. So over the years, there have been a number of theories that look at this process of socialization. And one of those theories was the psychoanalytic theory of socialization, which looks at it as kind of a 3-level process. The first level is the individual learning process, which is where the unconscious mind begins to shape behavior. And this is, again, kind of like the last slide, where these are lessons that we learn that there are no actual physical rules to, or conscious rules, or overt rules, right? So these are things that we learn or pick up through our experiences. So, for example, there was a study done with women some time ago where they gave women babies, and they said this baby is a little boy or this baby is a little girl, and then they observed how the women interacted with the children. When the women were told that the baby was a little boy, they would put it down, they would encourage it to roll over, crawl, be active, even if the baby was maybe not even at that developmental stage, where if they were told the baby was a little girl, they rarely put the babies down. They held them, they snuggled them, they held them very close, lots of kisses, touching, etc. And so you can see how, maybe over time that creates an unconscious behavior. Boys, we know, from a very early age are very active, and little girls are less so, even though physiologically there really is no difference between boys and girls until puberty. I apologize, I had to stop the dogs from eviscerating my cat. This is teaching on the fly, right? Okay, so the next level is formation of the self. And when we're looking at the formation of the self, what we're looking at is kind of that Freudian theory of that tension between the id and the superego, right? So the id is the party, fun-loving, I want what I want when I want it, part of our brain, and then the superego is the part of our brain that says, okay, now we need to look at what is right and what we should do, we should follow the rules. And essentially it's like that movement from 5-year-old to adult, where as a 5-year-old, we see an ice cream, we want it. We are told we need to wait. Well, we don't really do well with delayed gratification, right? And over time, we begin to develop that superego, which says, okay, you can wait after lunch. It would be better to have your ice cream after lunch or after dinner. That makes more sense. It's in line with, societal expectations, etc. And so we begin to formulate this notion of ourself. And if you take that first example, right, with the babies, this is where we start to formulate, are we going to be an active person? Are we going to be a more touching, caring, loving person? Plus, you add on not just how we're treated by our parents, but how we're treated by our peers, how society represents us. Boys and girls, we're given very different messages. A great exercise is to go either online or to the store. If you can go to the store, it's even better. And just walk through the baby section and look at the onesies, right? If you look at the onesies that are, for boys, in quotes, they've got trucks and baseballs and footballs and basketballs and, puppies on them. And then if you look at the girls, they've got butterflies and flowers and princesses, And so from the very beginning, we are given these unconscious messages and we begin to formulate this idea of who we are. And then, of course, the last level is that influence of society. And this begins from the very beginning. Obviously, the examples I gave you start from infancy. And then there's those societal expectations, which, although they change over time, certainly what it means to be a woman in today's society is not the same as what it meant to be a woman in, 1900. But the societal expectations still influence our development and how we're socialized. So if we take, for example, the 1900s, it was morally wrong for women to participate in sport. It was totally unseemly. They would sweat. All kinds of bad things could happen to the reproductive organs by all that running around. And so they begin to internalize the societal expectations and are socialized to believe that sport is not for them. All right, a similar message that is not given to boys. So that's what we're looking at, is kind of these different levels all converging throughout a lifespan to socialize us in our beliefs, not only about who we are, or what it means to be a boy or a girl, or what it means to be a certain race or sexuality, but what it means to be a physical being or even an athlete. Another theory of socialization is object relations theory. And this is, again, the various levels. So first looking at the individual. So this posits that infants most closely identify with the same-sex parent. Of course, you might be already thinking, okay, well, wait a minute. There are plenty of children who develop, who have one parent or two moms or two dads, and therefore do not have necessarily a parent of the same sex in their household. Definitely today's lifestyle has definitely changed this theory, but this is one of the original theories. And so the idea that infants identify with the same-sex parent and they watch that parent, and by watching that parent, they learn about what it means to be a boy or a girl. And they start to formulate these ideas of self. which also emerges as they separate themselves from their primary caretaker. So they begin to, think about going off to school, right? That's when the outside society really begins to have a larger impact. So now you've got peers and teachers, and you're more exposed to societal messages, which we'll get to in a minute. But you start to formulate an idea of self that is independent of your parent. Now, think about, growing up and saying, I want to marry my dad when I grow up, or I want to marry my mom, or I want to be just like my mom or just like my dad. This is what we're looking at. That formulation of self happens as we begin to separate from those ideas. And then, of course, the influence of society. And society has very, I don't want to say strict, because today it's more fluid, but it has very set ideas about what the family should look like and what each of us should do and who we should be. Especially if you think about like the division of labor, which in the family shapes a lot of our identity. So something that we'll see when we talk about youth sport was the youth sport movement largely developed because there was a lot of fear and concern that young boys were being overly feminized by stay-at-home moms. And we needed to make sure that we were getting them out there and making them tough and rugged and all of those things. And so the youth sport movement largely began from that space, especially for young boys. Obviously, there was not something similar going on for young girls. We weren't worried about them being overly feminized. And so that division of labor, whether it be gender roles or within the family, begins to shape that identity. The next theory of socialization is the social learning theory. And think about the nature versus nurture debate. This is all about nurture, right? So people respond to the stimuli that are in their environment, and specifically they respond to the social stimuli. So think about my example with the onesies, right? If, now, certainly a baby, an infant, is not having any thought process about what's on their onesie, and that probably has very little impact on them. However, it creates a reaction in others, right? So when you're wheeling a baby down, a 6-month-old baby in a onesie that can hardly move, and someone sees it and they see that it's wearing a blue onesie and it's got a puppy dog on it, and they're like, "Oh, you little rascal," or you're same thing, but you've got a little girl in a pink onesie and it's got a little butterfly. "Oh, what a sweet little princess," And that doesn't just happen as infants. That happens to us repeatedly over and over and over again as we go throughout our lives and we have, experiences. So I remember thinking about a sport experience, right? When I was in middle school, I loved the 49ers, and I couldn't wait until we did our football unit because I was going to be just like Joe Montana, and I just couldn't wait. And we got out there, and the football unit finally came, and my PE teacher split us up into girls and boys, and I thought, well, okay, that's weird, but it's all right, and he said, "Boys, here's a football, head out to the field." And so the boys took off, and then he said, "Girls, now this is what we call a football, and you just kind of toss it around like this," and he just did this like weak underhand granny toss. He's like, "Just amuse yourselves here on the black top until the boys and I get back." And that was it. And I just couldn't believe it, right? I couldn't believe it. This was not how Joe Montana did it. And so, we respond then to those social cues. Maybe girls don't play football. Maybe girls aren't good enough to play football. I've never seen a female football player. All these things start to go through our heads, and then that leads to that formation of the self, which is created through all of those interactions, both mentally, what our thought processes are as we interpret these messages, and we move throughout these social worlds. And then there's certainly the influence of society, which is essentially the core of social learning theory, which is that young children learn from the very beginning the principles that shape the external world. So, there's someone who once quoted that racism is a taught behavior. Think about that. Is there any baby that comes out of the womb believing that one race is superior than the other? That's not how it works, right? We learn those things. Society influences us, whether it's a message that we hear from our parents or our peers, or it's an image that we see repeated over and over within the media. So a typical sociological theory is functionalist theory, and functionalists have theories about socialization, just like other sociologists. So for a functionalist, the individual learning process occurs as people internalize their role expectations within society. So again, those are socially mandated and pushed upon us. We internalize those roles. Girls are expected to become nurses, boys are expected to become doctors, right? Perhaps it's an old role that is pushed and maybe is definitely different today, but essentially that's the mentality, what they're getting at. And then the self is formulated as we begin to internalize those values, and society reinforces those roles, and essentially they reward us or they punish us for that internalization, right? So again, think about, let's see, what would be a good example? I'll use myself. I am convinced that I am just as good as any man when it comes to sports. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm faster, but it does mean that I am just as skilled an athlete as anybody else, right? Society either punishes us or rewards us for that. So, especially when I was in high school, there was a lot of punishment for that belief, right? I wanted to challenge every boy that I saw to a race, whether it was a road race, foot race, whatever it was. I wanted to challenge them, and I was punished numerous times through the derision that I experienced from both men and women, that there was no way I could be as fast as a young man, right? If you act demure, right, and you act kind of like, I don't know if women have ever done this, but I definitely remember doing this around that stage too, was when you're around a boy, I would, act not quite as intelligent as I was. Like, I would ask a lot of questions, like I didn't know things even though I already knew them, right? And so, because that was society. Society said boys are supposed to know things, and they're supposed to be strong and intelligent, and girls are supposed to be demure and sit back, and let the boys take the center stage. And certainly these are heterosexual values that are pushed upon us. And I realize it has, changed dramatically, but there are certain elements of that still remain. And then we start to formulate that self based on those experiences. And then with a functionalist, the influence of society comes from this idea of equilibrium. So for a functionalist, society is always striving to maintain that kind of that homeostasis, right? Everything's in balance. And so, for example, if I am a woman who wants to be the first D1 female football coach, that throws society out of equilibrium because there hasn't been such a thing before. And what will that mean? And that's going to change everything that we know and that we believe. And so, society will punish that behavior and continue to punish it until we can get things back to equilibrium, back to the way things are, where everyone felt good about things, right? You can think about sexual orientation, for example. Many health curriculums now are looking to incorporate LGBTQIA inclusiveness, and there are many people who are like, this is wrong, we shouldn't do this, I don't want my children to learn about this. But so what they're trying to do is they're trying to push back to essentially what will create this equilibrium. And so when we look at movements, for example, the health movement, which I'm a part of, to create LGBTQIA inclusiveness in health education, there's that push continually to get back to the equilibrium of the way things were, the status quo, which is not necessarily a positive place. And so until there are enough people who believe in a certain set of theories, okay, for example, this health movement, inclusive health movement, to tip the equilibrium in the other direction. And therefore, equilibrium becomes when everyone believes that health education should be inclusive. So for a functionalist, it's always about finding that space where everything is cool, calm, and collected. Now, a conflict theorist is essentially that, always looking for conflict. And essentially, we develop our sense of self and are socialized according to what kind of conflicts we experience. So the individual learns about society through their identity, which is shaped by what opportunities are available to them. Now, okay, well, what role does conflict play in this? Well, think about it. Again, if we go back to a gender example, just because it's easy, until Title IX, it was not a given that women had opportunities to participate in sport. So if you are a woman from a pre-Title IX era, and a great opportunity for you is to talk to probably not mothers, but grandmothers for many of you, about what sport or health or physical activity was like pre-Title IX, you would see that a lot of the opportunities were heavily influenced by what was out there, right? So for my mom for example, she's not someone who likes sports, knows anything about sports, is interested in physical activity at all, and yet here I am, someone who works out, 6 or 7 times a week, is heavily involved in racing and have been since high school. And as part of the reason why I wasn't allowed to participate in sports until I was in high school was it wasn't deemed important. Because for my mom, there were no athletic opportunities. Cheerleading, she said that was the only thing that was available to them. So she doesn't really understand this whole, fitness boom and physical movement. So for a conflict theorist, our identity is shaped by what's available. So if sports are not available, our identity becomes that of either athlete for boys because sports were heavily available, or non-athlete for girls because they weren't available. The next part, as we formulate the self, is the group consciousness that comes from and is fostered in this context of a system of inequality. So for conflict theorists, there are inequalities that exist throughout our society, right? And we could talk about gender inequalities, race inequalities, class inequalities. I mean, pretty much anywhere there is a conflict for resources, right? A conflict theorist is at home. And basically what a conflict theorist says is that you formulate yourself based on your experiences with the systems of inequalities. So think about intersectional identities in particular here, right? We were talking about gender dynamics. Well, if you are, for example, a woman of color who is a lesbian, all right? Now you're looking at multiple systems of inequality that exist within our society. Perhaps you cannot get married in certain states. Perhaps you experience racism in whether covert or overt ways. Perhaps you experience sexism. And so at each turn, you're facing a variety of different inequalities that then influence your socialization, and you form your identity of self from that. And then the society is essentially operates, to a conflict theorist, operates as a form of social control. So there is this constant pressure to conform. So let's take the example of being a woman of color who is a lesbian, right? And let's say you begin to fight for your rights. You say that this is not fair, that this is not acceptable, and society will continue to push and push and push to get you to conform. And they will not stop pushing again until, we could bring in the functionalist here, the equilibrium shifts, that the majority belief in the society changes to one of acceptance. Now, a symbolic interactionist is going to have a much more micro perspective. So symbolic interactionists are very much focused on relationships, especially in dyads and triads, so small group. So for a symbolic interactionist, a child learns by taking on the roles of significant others. So it doesn't have to be a same-sex other, parent, guardian, caretaker, but just watching significant others. So okay, that could be a parent. It could be a parent and grandparents. It could be teachers. It could be anybody who's significant or holds a significant role within that child's life. So it's not limited just to the family. And the self emerges as that, that self begins to interact with the social expectations of others. So it could be society, which we'll look at in a second, but it can also be those significant others, right? So if you've ever had that experience where someone who is really important to you, okay, forget about everybody else, forget about just, the peanut gallery, right? But someone who is really important to you said something to you that you really took to heart, especially back when you were really young, right? Maybe you drew a picture and you worked on it. You were really, really proud of it, and you showed it to this person, this significant person, and they said, "Oh, okay, very good." Right, and you could tell that they weren't impressed with as much as you were, and so you begin to say, "Oh, maybe I'm not an artist," right? And you might be thinking, "Now, come on, we need to be stronger than that." But think about. I mean, really do think about this. Did you ever have that experience of someone really important to you kind of crushing you? Or the converse could be true too. Someone really lifting you up, making you believe that you could do something that you really didn't think that you could do. We'll use a sport example, right? So in rowing, we have coxswains, and coxswains steer the boat. That's their number one, job. But they also are piped through the boat. They have a microphone and there's speakers throughout the boat, and they talk to us. And when you're in, I mean, imagine this, if you've never had a person talking in your ear before, imagine the most painful part of your competition when you are hitting the wall and you are ready to give up and you cannot possibly go anymore. And then you've got someone in your ear saying, "Yes, you can. You've got this. Give me more. I know you have more." And you begin to believe it. So that self emerges as those, important, significant others play both positive, negative, or even neutral roles within your life. And then society, of course, adds another layer to that, where the expectations of others begin to form, that kind of context in which you learn. So, the way that we structure our various institutions, right, whether it be marriage or school or sports, there are certain expectations within those realms that teach us certain roles, or essentially teach us what our place can be within that space. So this is an interesting chart, right? If you take a look here, on the left are a number of abilities or skills, okay? And then on the right, what we're seeing essentially is the percentage of women and men who consider themselves at least above average on each of these traits. So how much value you see in yourself is very much affected by society. So how society sees you, right? So how self-confident are men? Well, men are often rated much higher in self-confidence than women. So if I say, who is more self-confident, men or women? Most people, both men and women, will say that men are more self-confident, that they have better emotional health, that they have better physical health, that they are better at computer skills, that they take more risks, that they're more popular, right? But if we look at something like, the drive to achieve, women are seen as having more drive to achieve and higher in cooperative skills, right? Some skills we see are fairly even, okay? Artistic ability, spirituality, is pretty close. Understanding of others, pretty close. But again, our ability to understand ourselves is largely influenced by how society perceives us. So I won't go into this slide in too much depth because essentially we've already been talking about it. But our primary socialization occurs very young, during our childhood. Our main socializing agents are, of course, our parents and our family. And we assimilate a worldview that is said to be quite stable. So essentially in our childhood, our idea about who we are and how the world works is fairly stable. Our secondary socialization occurs later in childhood, and this is where the socializing agents expand to include the school, peers, media, etc. And this stage is actually very unstable. It's unstable, sorry. And because we're getting so many different messages. For example, there are certain messages that I was given as a young child that as I got into high school and college and young adulthood, I questioned significantly, and as I heard new ideas and new perceptions of the world. And then our tertiary socialization occurs in adulthood. And most people think of our adulthood socialization as being fairly stable unless we experience major events, whether they be positive or negative. Major events can interrupt our adult socialization, but for the most part, it kind of goes back into a stable worldview. So families introduce children to the expectations of society. We do this both overtly and covertly. For example, talking in an elevator, right? If your child is like super wild in an elevator, they're talking really loud, we might say, now, we need to be quiet in elevators. We need to keep our hands to ourselves, right? A very overt message. Or it could be something far more covert. We've talked about many examples in the previous slides. So how parents define and treat a child is often crucial to that child's sense of self. And many of our early notions about who we are and whether it be our value individually or in society largely come from our parents. And I remember my aunt one time, my cousin was probably, I don't know, maybe in third grade or so, and she brought home a report card, and they had this new grading system. And it was minus, check, or plus. And she had mostly checks. And she asked her mom what that meant, and her mom said, well, you're not great, but you're not bad. You're just okay. Right? I just was horrified. And that gives you a certain notion, a certain idea that, oh, I'm just okay, right? And if that's reinforced by other people, as you grow and develop, whether right or wrong, it begins to influence that sense of self. And now there are some families that heavily emphasize things like educational achievement, where some might be more permissive, some emphasize strict obedience and discipline. This is something that I experienced quite a bit. I grew up in a working class family, and my husband grew up in more of a middle upper class family, and there are very distinct differences in parenting styles. In a working class family, and this was the case for many of my friends growing up, you did not, your parents are not your friends, and that seems to be something very, very big in today's middle class families. I see that a lot now as I've moved into the middle class as a professor, is that the parents are being buddy with their children, and it's bizarre to me. My husband does this, and I think when I try to give reasons, but when my child says, well, why do I have to do such and such? And I kind of look funny at them, and I'm like, because I said so, Or my husband is like, you need to explain why, and da-da-da. And I'm like, no, I don't. So, we get those different ideas about, who we are, largely, especially the initial ones, come from our families. And as many of you know, peer cultures start to influence us pretty significantly in later childhood. Likely right now, especially in college, your peers have more influence over you and your thought processes than your parents do. It's not universally the case, but it often happens around this time. And as you interact with your peers, you also learn a sense of self. You gain social skills. You form various values and attitudes. Girls' peer groups tend to be very closely knit and egalitarian. In fact, girls will often go out of their way to make sure things stay egalitarian. So if we want to use a sport example, it is very common for girls to be very uncomfortable with coaches who point out individual women within a sporting team and kind of put them on a pedestal or use them as the constant example, because that disrupts that equilibrium within the women's team. And so they will do what they can to kind of keep things egalitarian. That might even go so far as the person who is kind of put up on that pedestal deferring the praise and actually being very uncomfortable with the praise to keep things, even and level. Now, boy peer groups tend to be more hierarchical. There's definite status distinctions between members, and that does not necessarily cause a rift. So for a young man to be, in an athletic sense, to be held up on a pedestal and put above peers, it is not seen as problematic, it is seen as, wow, we need to achieve the same as this young man, or no, I'm better than him and I'm going to prove it. The hierarchy, can shuffle and reshuffle. Now, again, these are not universal for boys and girls, but these are some of the findings that we've seen throughout the literature and repeated across time. So this is not, old data. This is even today. We continue to see these patterns existing and repeating. Schools definitely have, certain expectations and ways that they encourage children to think and behave. Certainly part of my role, or at least I believe that part of my role, is to not just teach you facts and things like that, but to encourage you to think in a different way. In fact, that is more my goal than teaching you anything in particular about sport. For example, the Super Bowl is tomorrow, and I am hoping that you will watch the commercials with a fine-tooth comb and a fine eye to look at the different ways that gender or race or sexuality or class or religion or sport are presented, and what that means for how we think about sport, how we think about athletes, even how we think about ourselves, or a sports fan. That would be a great activity. Watch for how sports fans are portrayed. That's one I've never done before, and I will make a conscious decision to do that, and I'll report back. But in my mind, it's more about teaching you how to think, right? So that is my focus in the school setting. We know that research shows that teachers respond differently to both boys and girls. Boys tend to receive more of their attention, and that often, what is called the hidden curriculum consists of a lot of subtle messages about social roles. So probably the most recent example would be like the STEM movement for young girls, right? Because many felt that within the sciences, technology, engineering, math, that young women were being given these very subtle messages and hints that this is not where you belong. You are not good at math. You are not good at engineering. And that hidden curriculum, certainly nothing overtly said that, but there were certain subtle messages that often came through. Religion is another piece of the socializing puzzle. Children begin by developing the same religious beliefs as their parents. Often unquestionably, they, say, what are you? My mom is Catholic, I am Catholic. That's usually how it begins. But eventually you begin to develop your own sense of faith. Now, that might continue to align with your parents' sense of faith or your guardian's sense of faith, but it might begin to differ. Or essentially it changes in that you don't believe it, or you are not essentially ex-religion because my mom is, or because my dad is, or whatever. It's because of X, Y, Z, right? So you have foundational reasons for being a part of a religion. Those who disavow their religion often return to their original faith at some point in their life, especially if they have strong ties to their family, and after they have families of their own. So I suppose you could use the returning to the flock adage, right? Is something that we often see within the research. And religious socialization also influences our beliefs about gender and race and sexuality in particular. As I have worked with the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer population, there are many LGBTQ folks who are extremely religious and struggle very much because they believe and they have a faith, and yet there are many religions out there that disavow any type of sexuality that is not heterosexual. It is a very difficult struggle because religion is, when we talk about socialization, for many people, religion is a part of their core and foundational self. And without that, there is a deep sense of loss. And although we only have this one slide here on the media, clearly we have an entire chapter devoted to the media. and the media has a significant influence on today's culture. Many of us, especially young people like yourselves, you've been so bombarded with the media your whole lives that there's not a lot of research out there that looks at, okay, how does this generation respond to the media? Are you critical consumers of the media? For my generation in particular, which started kind of without that constant media, but has moved into being fairly young, okay, with this constant media, it's seen as a very dangerous thing because it is 24/7, and there's different stats you can pull up about how many media messages we're bombarded with on a daily basis. Take the Super Bowl, for example. And imagine if the Super Bowl was our only experience of the world. And what would we think about society after watching the Super Bowl, right? The Super Bowl commercials and things like that. I have to say I have already previewed a couple of commercials with football dads doing their young daughter's hair. And I am interested to know what you all think about those commercials and whether they display positive messages, negative messages, neutral messages, etc. The average young person spends, nearly 7 hours a day immersed in the media in some form, often using multiple forms simultaneously. I see many students walking across campus with earbuds in while they're on their phone. I've walked behind people that were talking to each other, standing right next to each other, but on their phones. I have many students who are expected to text parents multiple times a day. Right? Television remains the dominant medium, although more and more, and every year, this is starting to shift. Half of all youth use a computer daily, and within certain populations, we see much higher use of smartphones rather than an actual computer. Analysts estimate that by age 18, the average child will have witnessed at least 18,000 simulated murders on television. And of course, the question often comes, especially for folks of my generation and older, is what impact does that then have when actual murders occur? So when we see a mass shooting at a school, what kind of impact does that have on today's youth? If they are so immersed in these simulated murders, does it have the same impact? Does it evoke the same empathy? For example. So that's something that is constantly being explored as media has continued to grow and develop at a very exponential rate. And of course, we had to put sports in there, right? Through sports, men and women learn concepts of the self. Think about all of the different lessons that you learned as an athlete. Again, that could be just, PE class. It could be a club sport. It could be serious intensive sport. It could be D1 athlete. All of those messages that you were given, how you learned about yourself, how you became to think about yourself. I was blessed with a number of wonderful coaches who encouraged me, and I also experienced a number of coaches who were very, very critical. Especially not being able to join sports until I was much older. It's very difficult, much older. I was 16. It's difficult though. Imagine trying to join a soccer team at 16 years old, never having played soccer outside of physical education. And back in my day, PE was taught by your mainstream classroom teacher. And pretty much all I remember from that is windmills, cherry pickers, and dodgeball. And try and imagine joining soccer, joining basketball at 16 years old. I'm almost 6 feet tall. Coaches salivated over me when I walked into the court, but I had absolutely no skill. And by that point, many of them, were not able or willing to teach me skills. You had to come in already knowing these sports. And so sports can be a significant influencer in how we see the self. And I think probably my early experiences, my more negative early experiences, drastically influenced my positive experience with rowing, because on the West Coast, rowing is a sport that is not common, and therefore they have an entire novice year devoted to learning the sport when you join. And so I was with a bunch of other people like myself who had never done it before. And as I started to excel and I was encouraged, that had a pretty significant influence on me and how I thought about myself. As I tell my rowers that I coach, and I have a shirt to prove it, rowing made me awesome. And I don't just mean I was good at it and I excelled, which I did, but it made me awesome in a lot of different spaces, right? I was okay at school, and I was an okay public speaker, and an okay, at this, that, and the other. But once I got into rowing and I was supported and I excelled, I became great at lots of things. It empowered me in so many ways, and hopefully many of you have had that experience within your sporting space. Men often learn that being competitive in sports is considered a part of quality manhood. We will definitely talk more about that when we talk about gender distinctions in sport, and we'll even talk about it in the next voice thread where we talk about the sport ethic. That being not just being an athlete, but being a good athlete, a competitive athlete, is a significant part of the male development process. And often what we find is that women in sports develop much stronger senses of body confidence, which is typically denied them by the cultural images of women's bodies. So, for example, take any women's magazine, right? And I don't look like any of those women, right? Like I said, I'm almost 6 feet tall. I'm a rower, so I'm pretty, thick in the quads and arms. I don't look like any of those women, and that, but I guess on the same token, those women couldn't possibly do what I do in a boat because they're too tiny. They'd break, and so, if you look at the media images of women, even sometimes female athletes, who are often portrayed in evening gowns rather than actually involved in their sport, we're, as women, are often denied a sense of being bodily competent. We might be, intelligent, but that we are somehow weak in physical nature. And that cultural image, can be positively or negatively impacted by our own sports participation. So what we're going to look at next is essentially we're going to kind of move ourselves into the youth sport, because that's where we're headed here in a couple of weeks. And when we look at youth sport, the key issues are, one, how youth is socialized into sport, and then how is a youth socialized via sport. And these are different, because one is, how do we get into sport in the first place? So how did you end up on a sports team, participating in a sport at whatever your beginning sport age was, right? How did that happen? Who introduced it to you? What encouraged you, right? And then what kind of socialization happened while you participated in a sport? And those are two very different things. So that's what we're going to focus on for the rest. So basically what we're doing is we're taking what we talked about in the first half of the PowerPoint and we're applying it now to sports. So from an educational perspective, how do we become physically active? How do we become an athlete, right? So think about that. How did you become a physically active being, all right? And if you are an athlete, how did you become an athlete? Or you used to be an athlete, or you can still consider yourself an athlete whether or not you participate in competitive sports currently, okay? So think about your socializing agents. Think about the socializing institutions that affected you, right? Parents, family, peers, school, sport, media. And think about your own sport history. So like I said, right, I wasn't allowed to participate in sports until I was in high school, and there were several reasons for that. One was, like I said, I was from a working class family. My parents worked long hours. We barely put food on the table. There were a lot of Top Ramen weeks, not days, weeks, in every month. And, sports cost. I was right at that time when public schools were starting to eliminate sports. And so it was becoming increasingly privatized, and we couldn't afford it. More than that, my parents worked long hours. They could not take me to practices, and before I could drive, I certainly couldn't go on my own. Now, I did move into, my parents purchased a very cheap home in a little bit nicer neighborhood, which allowed me to go to a different set of schools. And I was surrounded by friends who were involved in sports, multiple sports, languages, artistic endeavors, musical endeavors, things like that. And it was a very weird space to be because that was not my experience, right? Okay. And then, as I got older, then I became, increasingly interested in all these different things that my friends were doing. And since, music, art, those kinds of things continued to cost money well into middle school and high school, if I participated in the sport at the high school, it was paid for. So that's when I began to join athletics. Of course, as I already explained, my struggles trying to join athletics at 16 years old. But that was how my sport history began. No one actually encouraged me into sports. Certainly, I showed up for tryouts, and coaches looked really happy to see me, and then they watched me play. And they were like, wow, so bad. And, so I wasn't encouraged in that way. I think for me, it was more the peers. Like I said, we had moved into this different neighborhood, and so many of my peers were involved in all kinds of things. And, I thought, the sport thing at least is free at the school. I should do that. And so that's kind of how I got into it. And I started seeking out my own, endeavors. But it's important to think about your own sport history, how you got into it, and how you stayed into it, right? Who kept you motivated? My parents did not come to I started in cross country. My parents did not come to my races. They did not come to the dinner. They were not there when I was awarded awards. I purchased my own running shoes. I did all of the work on my own. So, thinking about how you stayed involved in sports, for me, it was a lot of self-motivation. Where for other folks, I know that parents play a pretty significant role in taking them to and from activities, purchasing equipment, private coaching, things like that. So now if we're looking at socialization via sport, all right, so what kind of socialization occurs while you're in sport? Sport is a subculture within society, so it reflects the norms and values of the current society. Again, that shifts over time, as we've seen throughout sport history, but for the main part, it is a mirror of society. Of course, my hope is that we can change and transform sports so that society can begin to mirror it rather than the other way around. But that is a work in progress. So, how do we treat each other? How do we make sense of those who are different from ourselves? How do we handle conflicts? You can't just do sports, right? It's not a matter of just being there and, it doesn't exist in a bubble. I encourage you to watch the link that is here and to take a look at, some of the lessons that we learn or maybe society has learned through sports. Right, so we got a taste of bad sportsmanship moments. And essentially, that presents the dark side of sports. We certainly learn positive things from sports as well. But, it is very easy, unfortunately, to type in, sportsmanship and, the top 10 bad things that have happened in sports usually is what comes up. So if we take a practical application of this, we can look at Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory, which is essentially breaking the self up into these different systems. And this is really no different than many of the different theories that we've talked about. You are kind of at the center. You have your smallest microsystems surrounding you, which are the people that you're closest to, places that you spend a lot of time, and then, family, school, etc. And then, as we move out into the mesosystem. And this is, you can see that family is in the microsystem, but also in the mesosystem, because family, school, peers, they have different influences, as we talked about, at different life points. So they might be a part of your closest microsystem when you are young, but they might move out into the mesosystem as you grow and develop. And then you have your exosystem, which is, the economic system that you exist within. As I said, growing up in a working class family, that certainly had impacts on my sporting endeavors. Political systems, educational systems, etc. And then you have this macro system, which is your overarching beliefs and values, or essentially, I don't want to say your overarching beliefs and values, but society's overarching beliefs and values. And then the chrono system, which is the dimension of time. And having just finished history, or the historical experiences or exploration of sport, you recognize, or I hope you recognize, how important time, or how important a role time plays in our sporting experiences. As the example I gave earlier on, right, being a pre-Title IX versus a post-Title IX female, that has a significant impact on sporting experiences. Always remember to put things in context, and context is always a function of time. So the title of this slide is Consequences of Socialization. I know that sounds very negative, but the consequence of socialization is that it establishes certain self-concepts. And as we've talked about all the way throughout, some of these are positive self-concepts, and some of them perhaps are negative self-concepts. As I said, rowing made me feel very strong, very powerful, not just in sports, but in life. But when I was a cross-country runner, I also had coaches who continually told me that I was too big, that I would need to lose weight. I think I was 6 feet, 130 pounds at one point, and they were still on me about being too big. And it wasn't later until I realized that they really meant I was too tall, or at least they thought I was too tall to be an effective runner, distance runner. But I kept thinking, I'm too fat, I'm too fat. And that concept was not corrected by anybody, so I continued believing it for quite some time. That was actually what I really loved about rowing. Was the first thing the coach said to me was like, you got to get bigger, which I was like, I like you. Let's get some cake. Anyway, so it establishes those self-concepts, both positive and negative. It definitely creates a capacity for us to take on certain roles. So, for example, it was in college, one of my first experiences with leadership. So I was the women's team captain. And I'll be honest, I failed miserably at it the first go around. I was a terrible, terrible captain. I had never been in that kind of leadership role before, and I just crashed and burned. But it was a learning experience. It created a capacity for me to take on leadership in other ways. And I'm currently the captain of the women's team that I row for now. And I believe, at least from what people tell me, I do a much better job now that I have grown and developed and learned. It creates a tendency for people to act in socially acceptable ways. So, imagine, there are some people that postulate essentially that we have this urge to be physical, to be even violent, and that sport provides an outlet for those feelings and behaviors, but in a socially acceptable way. Certainly, if I'm walking down the street, I cannot just tackle to the ground any person who walks by, but if I have this urge to just be physical, and I'm on a football field, for example, that is perfectly acceptable, right? And then it also makes people the bearers of culture. So just as we are socialized into our sport, we socialize others. Certainly, if you've ever been on a sports team and you've been one of the upperclassmen, you socialize the newbies, the newcomers, into the culture of your sport or your society or your space. I'm not going to go through this in depth, but it is just another model of sport participation, and you can kind of look at, as we age, and the model starts at about 6 years old, and most of the time we see, sports beginning in that 4, 5, 6 range, okay, that most people, enter into sport, and then they follow different paths. So the one path to the left is this sampling years where you're participating in lots of different sports. You begin to either specialize into a certain sport, or you kind of move out of maybe intense competitive practice and go into more recreational space. If you specialize, you begin to invest, all right, and then there are probable outcomes. And then for many today, and we'll talk about this more with youth sport, you might get your entry into sport, but then you might be pushed to specialize very early. And that's something that we see today, an increasing early specialization in the sporting realm. For example, there are stories that Venus and Serena Williams' father, Tiger Woods' father, decided when they were just infants what sports they were going to play, and pretty much worked them through those sports from the very beginning. All have possible outcomes, both positive and negative, and I'll let you look at that in a little bit more depth. And if you click the link on this slide, you can look at another way or another kind of idea about how we become members of the social world of sport. This one is particularly focused on NBA hazing, and I hope you enjoy it. And so as we're finishing up these last few slides, we're looking at how sport affects our lives. And there are many studies of sport experiences and the various impacts that they can have, positive, negative, neutral. And what we find is that people define and give meaning to their sport experiences in connection with their social relationships. So again, sport doesn't happen in a bubble, right? We give meaning to our experiences as they kind of fit into our social world. So let's see, for example, I've been using a lot of myself here, but it's my frame of reference, right? I was very, very passionate about winning. I'm a big fan of winning. I like medals. I'm all about the hardware. And when I was in college, that really made me an outcast, right? So, I was always focused on being the best, and I didn't care what that took or what it looked like. If my coach put me up on a pedestal, I loved it. And that, as we talked about, for many women is very threatening. Many women and teams are very focused on homeostasis. And so the meaning that I gave to my early rowing experiences in college, while very empowering, were also socially very isolating, right? Where over time I learned to balance a little bit more. And I assigned different meaning to my sport experiences in connection to social relationships. I began to seek out women who were equally, I don't want to say competitive, because every woman I've ever rowed with was competitive, but just had a different conception of what it meant to be a female athlete, to be empowered, to be powerful, right? So those meanings change depending on how we connect them to our social world. And we give these meanings to our sport experiences. They're always grounded in cultural definitions, right? Related to whether it's our gender, our race, our ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, whatever characteristics are defined as important in our world. So in the world of rowing, it is a very white, upper class, elitist sport, right? I think the average income of a master rower, which is anybody who's out of college but continues to row, is well into the 200,000s, right? And here I was, in college, this working class kid who was a rower, and I was surrounded by people who were nothing like me in that respect. I have stayed the night at some of the most beautiful homes I've ever seen in my entire life. And when we would travel to anywhere that was near my home, I was like, you're not coming to my house. So those cultural definitions, our experiences are always socially and culturally grounded. Now, I want to just point something out quickly with Adler's findings with regards to sports. So some athletes, as I said, in high-profile sports experience what's called enroll engulfment. And the best example that I can give, the easiest example I can give to understand this is when an athlete retires. Okay, you can even think about athletes who have retired and then come back and then retired again. The especially in today's culture, the more we become consumed with certain roles, and this could be sports, it could be anything, it could be work, whatever. The more we become engulfed in that role, that role takes over every aspect of our lives, the more we are affected by the different things that happen within it. So, experiencing an injury, even a simple injury, even something that takes you got to take 2 weeks off, right? Can have a deep negative impact on us if our entire life revolves around our sport experience and we've got to take 2 weeks off. Think about longer injuries, surgeries that require months of rehab. Think about a sudden catastrophic career-ending injury. Okay, think about when our athletes retire. The average athletic career for a football player is 3 to 5 years in the pros and 5 to 7 years for an NBA player. This means that we have many young men and young women, although we don't see it as much with young women, and we can talk about that at another time, who at a very young age are very lost because so much of their identity has been wrapped up in their sport experience for so long that they don't have other outlets that kind of pick them up as their life shifts and changes. Now, the reasons why we don't tend to see that with women, even when we look at professional female athletes like WNBA players, is because of the way women's sport has been treated historically. Many women realize that the end of their high school career, the end of their college career is the end of their sporting experience, at least at that elite competitive level. And so many of them have identities that exist beyond the sporting realm. And even WNBA players know that there's an expiration date stamped on female athletes. And so they tend to have much more broadly defined identities. And so when they suffer injury, when they have to retire, then when sport is no longer a part of their day-to-day lives in the same way that it was, they tend to fare a little bit better than we've seen men. So this idea of hegemony is one that we'll revisit again and again. So it's important to mention here with regards to socialization because hegemonic processes are essentially, maybe a good way to describe it would be like status quo, right? What is expected? And sports are very important sites for hegemonic processes because they are, well, they're so taken for granted. I mean, it's just sport. It's just play. It's just fun. And yet, again, we'll use the Super Bowl as an example. If you watch the Super Bowl in its entirety, if you really listen to the announcers, you watch what they talk about, you watch the language that they use, you watch the commercials, etc., you can see how many social messages are being given out in these various spaces. And they're not accidental. They are a way of teaching us or indoctrinating us, depending on how you want to look at it, into our society. And if we were to watch, a different sporting event in a different country, it would be a similar process, but very different, right? The hegemonic process is the same, but what values are pushed would be very different. And corporate sponsors in particular in today's day and age have used this to their advantage, right? So, for example, the beer commercials. Beer commercials are always rampant in the Super Bowl, right? And if you drink this beer, no matter what, you will get if you're a man, you will get the hot Barbie model, right? And you drink this beer and that will happen. And if you use this shampoo, you will go from frizzy to sleek in no time at all, right? And they sell products, and probably the silliest example, I know this voiceover has been long already, but the funniest example I ever had with this was my daughter and I were taking a shower, and she's a little kid, and she said, "I want to use Daddy's soap." And I said, "Okay." So I hand it to her, and it's one of those Axe body wash. And she puts it on, she's looking at the back of the bottle, and I don't know if any of you have ever seen X, but there's like a little comic strip on the back, and it shows a guy in the shower washing with the body wash, and in the next picture he's got the girl, and she said, "Mommy, why is Daddy using this? He already has you." And I said, "Well, maybe he used that and that's how he got me." And she says, "I don't think so." And it was so funny. She says, "I'm going to use it." And the next day she came home and she goes, "You know what? It didn't work at all." So, I mean, but think about it. That is so naive, but that's essentially what these corporate sponsors are trying to do. And as Gramsci said, it is very difficult to fight these ideological outposts. They take up residence unconsciously in our minds. And we go out and we choose Axe body wash, unconsciously thinking that this will be the thing that solves our love issues or whatever it might be. So definitely think about this idea of hegemony, because it will come up again and again.